Hey, welcome back. So, we had in the last 2 weeks the story of Icarus and Daedalus and the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. And there's a little more to the story of Theseus than I gave. There's sort of this long voyage between his trip from Trajan to Athens where he gets to meet his father. But that video was already getting pretty long at 40 minutes, so I didn't include that part. But there's some kind of fun in a really creepy way stories along the way with him defeating all sorts of like monsters and bad guys along the way that I mentioned as just sort of an aside, but I think I'll come back and add those later, maybe in sort of a mini episode. But now I'm going to do a two-part episode, one of the most famous of the Greek myths, one that I kind of knew growing up even before I'd really heard of Greek myth because I was a huge fan of the original Clash of the Titans movie. And the main character in Clash of the Titans is the Greek hero Perseus. Now, the Perseus that ends up showing up in Clash of the Titans actually doesn't resemble the real Perseus in a lot of ways, the original Perseus from Greek myth, but a lot of the elements were there. Enough so that when I realized, once my mom introduced me to Greek myth, that there was indeed a story of Perseus, I got super excited. So, I'm going to start out with sort of the backstory of Perseus and the origin of the Gorgon Medusa, and then next week we will get into the adventure proper of Perseus. Now, one of the things that I want to do with showing the story of Perseus is kind of show that there is a pedigree to these Greek heroes. They don't just come out of nowhere. If you study Greek myth, you can find actual family trees showing where the different heroes came from and who they were related to. Now, some of us have very simple family trees. Some of us have more complicated family trees. But no one has a tree as complicated as a Greek hero. In part because Zeus. When you have somebody who lives forever and is interested in humans and has children with multiple humans, you will get family trees where Zeus is the great great grandfather, the grandfather, also an uncle, all in the same family tree. People end up being related to each other in very, very weird ways. And Perseus ends up being related to one of those more complicated family trees. And it starts with a king named Danaus. And Danaus had a brother, Egyptus. And they were kings in Libya. And Danaus had 50 daughters who he was very, very proud of. They were lovely, wonderful daughters. And they actually were called the Danaides because they were the daughters of Danaus. It just so happens that his brother Egyptus had 50 sons. How convenient. My 50 sons marry your 50 daughters. We have a wonderful dynasty here. Except Danaus didn't want his daughters marrying Egyptus's 50 sons. Aside from the whole cousin thing, which is its own thing, but royalty. Anyway, Egyptus' sons were known for being rough and rowdy and wild, and Danaus felt that his daughters deserved better. And in fact, he had many people who were interested in marrying his daughters once they were of age. So he decided, you know what? I'll get out of here. He took his 50 daughters down to the shore, and they got on a ship, and they sailed away. They rowed away. Danaus at the helm of the ship, and his 50 daughters rowing the ship. And they rowed west until they got to Argos in Greece. And the people in Argos see this gorgeous, fancifully crafted royal ship skim into the harbor with 50 beautiful women at the oars and a kingly man standing at the helm. And they're like, yeah, we're definitely talking king material here. And they made Danaus their king. And everything was good. Danaus was a good king. It was a time of happiness, a time of prosperity. Everyone is happy with the idea of Danaus being king. But it seems that Egyptus hadn't given up on Danaus' daughters being his daughters-in-law, because one day, into this peaceful kingdom of Argos, rose another ship with 50 people at the oars. This time, it's Egyptus' sons. And Danaus can't go anywhere. He's now settled. He is a king. This is his new kingdom. He's not going to run away again. And he can't fight off the brothers. And he doesn't want to deal with the conflict of saying no. So he comes up with a much simpler, much more straightforward plan. He accepts the wedding proposals for his daughters, and he calls for a glorious wedding feast. And it's a great wedding celebration, a great wedding feast. All 50 daughters are married, and then they all go to their rooms in the palace with their new husbands. And it's 50 daughters, 50 sons, and 50 daggers. Because Danaus had given each of his 50 daughters a knife with which to kill their husband on their wedding night. And they all did it. They all slew their husbands. It was a slaughter. All except for one. There's one daughter, Hypernestra. She had actually fallen in love with her new husband, Lynceus, and she couldn't bring herself to kill him. So she was the only one who didn't kill her husband, and she and Lynceus, knowing what slaughter had just occurred, they decided to beat it, to get out. They left. They got out of Argos, which left King Danaus with his 49 widowed daughters. And nobody wanted to marry his daughters. Gee, I wonder why. But the Danaides, these 49 daughters, they spent the rest of their lives as princesses with no princes, no husbands. And they were looked down upon for the crime that they had committed, which, by the way, their father had asked them to commit, but separate story, separate issue. And eventually, when each of them died and went to the underworld, because they had committed the crime of killing a family member, they were, as a group, given a special, horrible task. They were given the job of filling a giant bath with water to wash away their sins. However, the tool they were given to carry the water from the well to the bath, they were each given a sieve. And so, they couldn't get out of their punishment until their sins were washed away, but they couldn't get their sins washed away until the bath was full, and that bath was never going to be full. So that was their punishment. The punishment for Danaus was really that he died with no grandchildren that he knew of. And he had felt he had doomed his kingdom. And in the end, Hypernestra and Lynceus did come back to Argos. As he was nearing his death, they came back to Argos, and Lynceus became king, with Hypernestra his queen. And things were good. And as they passed on, their son, Abbas, he became king after them. And things were good. And then that brings us close to the actual start of our story with Acrisius. Acrisius became king after Hypernestra and Lynceus. Except it was rough, because Acrisius had a brother, Proteus, and the two of them were supposed to rule Argos together. However, neither one wanted to share, especially Acrisius. He wanted to be king of the whole kingdom. And so through a long and tangled battle between brothers, he finally managed to drive Proteus out. And he's king, and everything is going to be good. And he can't wait to meet his heir, except he never has a son. He never has any son to pass the throne on to. All he has is his daughter, Danae. And he's worried because the throne is supposed to pass down to his first son. And he goes to the oracle. He needs to know what the future holds. He needs to know what is going to go on with his kingdom. And he visits the oracle at Delphi, who was devoted to Apollo, guarded by Apollo, and was the place you went to if you wanted to know your fate, wanted to know your future. And Acrisius didn't get good news. The news he got was this: your daughter, Danae, will have a son, and that son will kill you and become king in your stead. Well, that's not the news he wanted to get. But to be honest, I can't think of a single story where some king actually got the news that he wanted to get when he went to the oracle. But that's beside the point. But he's like, nah, not looking to get killed by my own grandkid. So he went back to his kingdom. And he built a tower. And the tower was for Danae to live in. And he built the tower, well, his servants built the tower around Danae. Around her, as in, she was inside it, they built it, and there were no doors, there were no windows. She was going to be alone and husbandless for the rest of her days. He was not risking anyone overthrowing him. And so, all there was for her was a little slit that they could pass trays of food in through, and up in the very, very high ceiling of the tower, an opening, a hole through which she could at least see the sky, because, she's his daughter and he loves her and he doesn't want her being happy, so hey, look, you get a square foot of sky. And wouldn't you know it, that square foot of sky was just enough for Zeus to see Danae. And Zeus liked what he saw, and Zeus came to visit Danae many times. Until one day, Acrisius is walking through the courtyard, and as he happens to be going near the tower where his daughter is imprisoned, he turns to his guards and says, I think I hear a baby. Did you bring a baby? Did you bring a baby? I didn't bring a baby. Where am I hearing a baby? Oh my Zeus, is that sound coming from the tower? And they knock a hole in the tower wall, and sure enough, there's Danae holding a beautiful baby boy. A beautiful baby boy that she had named Perseus. So now Acrisius is in trouble, because the prophecy is halfway to fulfilled. His daughter has had a son. So the simple solution would be kill the son, maybe, his daughter too, but there's problems with that. First of all, in Greek myth, the crime of killing a family member was a horrible crime you did not want to commit. There were a set of goddesses called the Furies, that one of their only jobs was to punish people who killed their own family members. You didn't want to deal with that. On top of that, Acrisius knew who the father was, because, let's face it, pretty girl, locked in the tower, view of the sky, Zeus. And so he was not about to go and kill the demigod baby son of the king of the gods. So, another elegant solution. Hopefully this time it would be foolproof. Acrisius wasn't going to kill the child or his daughter, and he wasn't going to order any of his men to kill the child or the daughter. Instead, simple solution, he had his carpenters build a box. A large wooden box big enough to hold an adult. Some might say a coffin. And into this box, he had put his daughter and her baby boy. And then they sealed the box shut. And they took it down to the beach, walked it out into the waves, and shoved it out with the receding tide. And the box drifted out to sea. And Acrisius said, "Ah, perfect. I will have not killed the child or my daughter. Poseidon will have killed the child and my daughter. And now everything will be perfect." Except Poseidon happened to be paying attention and knew exactly what was going on, and no way was he going to let himself be chumped for some mortal king to kill his brother's child and mistress. So, Poseidon sent the gentle sea nymphs, because some of them weren't so gentle, but he sent some of the gentlest sea nymphs to guide the box across the sea onto the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys pulled the box out of the water in his net. And Dictys looks at the box and goes, "Hey, maybe it's a treasure." And he opens up the box, and it's a girl in a box. And a baby with a girl in a box. And this is not normal. And so the fisherman does what any decent human being would do. 1, he helps her out of the box. 2, he takes her home and gives her some food and a safe place to sleep. And the next morning, when she feels like it, she tells him the story. She tells him what happened. And being a good and decent man, the fisherman says, "You can stay with me. I have no wife. I have no child. I'm all alone here, feeling kind of lonely. You stay here. I'll feed you and your son. You help me take care of my small home, and we'll be all good." And Danae loves the idea. Perseus the baby doesn't give much input because baby. But time goes on. Everything is good. Except the fisherman did his best to keep his new house guest a secret. Because even though he was just a lowly fisherman, his brother, Polydictus, was the king. And he wasn't a bad king, but he was a king. And kings tended to want what kings tended to want. And Dictys looked at this beautiful young woman, and he thought, she's already had enough trouble. She does not need any of this mess with my brother if he ever gets an eyeful of her. So he kept her hidden. He kept her secret. And they were happy. And Perseus grew up tall and proud and strong, like most sons of Zeus. And he helped his sort of adoptive father around the beach, around the shores with the fishing. And he grew up very, very strong, and he swam and he ran. And one day Polydictus noticed this, handsome, athletic young man, and found out he was living with his brother. And then when he found out this handsome young man named Perseus was living with his brother, he found out that the beautiful young mother of Perseus was also living with his brother. And Polydictus wanted to marry Danae. But Danae said no. As far as she was concerned, she already had a husband. She had Zeus. And she had a son by Zeus, and she didn't need anything else. And there was a family history with marriages that she didn't want to deal with, so no thank you. You can find another bride. But Polydictus didn't want another bride. And even more than that, it was not a good look for a simple fisherman's companion, a fisherman's maid, for lack of a better term, to say no to a king's wedding proposal. It stung his pride. He did not like it, and he decided not to accept it. He was going to marry her, whether she wanted to or not. The only trick of it was Perseus. He wasn't going to be able to force Danae to marry him as long as Perseus was around. And so, like other kings we happen to have mentioned in the story, he decided to get a little tricky. And he let it be known that he was going to get married, but not to this, fisher maid. He was going to be getting married to Princess Hippodamia. And since her name translated, Hippodamia, it translated as tamer of horses, in honor of his upcoming wedding, which was not going to happen, in honor of his very fake wedding, every man on the island, every household on the island, was to bring him a horse as a wedding gift. And the day came for everyone in Seriphus to present the horse to their king. And by the way, this was not going to be easy on a lot of the people. There were a lot of one-horse farms that were going to have to give their only horse. There were a lot of no-horse farms that were going to have to spend a lot of money to get a horse to give to the king. But when Perseus walked up to the throne, representing their household, he had to admit that they had nothing. There was no horse, and there would be no horse. He and Dictys, Polydictys, king, Dictys, fisherman, he and Dictys, they made enough money to keep their family fed, and that was about it. And Polydictys was in a good mood. It was like, oh, don't worry. I figured your household was so wretched and so poor and had so little to give. I actually didn't expect my brother or his house guests to be able to give anything of worth anyways. Don't worry about it. None of us expected any better of you. And he went on and on about, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Nobody expects you to be able to do anything. And it had exactly the effect that he had wanted it to have. He hurt Perseus's pride. He stung Perseus. And Perseus grew angry. And Perseus said, no. I will still give you gifts. I can't give you a horse, but I'll give you anything else you ask for. Whatever you ask for, I will find it and I will get it for you. And Polydictys smiled, took a sip of his wine, not wine, tea. He took a sip of his wine and leaned forward and said, anything? Anything, my boy? Yes, I will bring you anything you ask for. I will bring it. We are not wretched. We are of worth. And Polydictys said, you know what I've always thought would be great decoration hanging on my wall? The head of Medusa. So go, young Perseus. Go. Find Medusa. Kill her. Bring me her head so I can hang it on my wall. And don't come back without it. And the throne room was filled with a stunned silence. And Perseus swallowed, nodded his head, and bowed deeply before walking out of that throne room. And as far as Polydictys and his men were concerned, they were never going to see Perseus again. Because of the Gorgon sisters. Now, there's different versions of the origins of the Gorgon sisters. One of the versions has to do with an ongoing feud between Athena and Poseidon and a family of sisters that got caught in the middle. But the version I'm going to give you has to do with they're not really gods or goddesses. They're somewhere between gods and monsters. But the goddess monster Keto and the god monster Phorkys. And they were children of the Titans and of Gaia, and descendants of those really, really early primal beings in Greek myth. And they were both lords of the sea. They were sort of embodiments of the rough and dangerous nature of the sea. Poseidon might be the representation of the sea as power and a source of food. But Phorkys and Keto, they were embodiments of the ship that leaves harbor and never comes home. And they had multiple children, some of whom were mostly human, like the Grey sisters, some which weren't even remotely human, like the dragon Ladon. But probably their most famous children were the three Gorgon sisters. And the three Gorgon sisters were Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Now, Stheno and Euryale, they were immortal. They were going to live for forever, just like the gods and other gods and goddesses. Medusa, for some reason, had been born mortal. But other than that, she was a lot like her sisters. And by a lot like her sisters, I mean hideously ugly. Like super, super duper ugly. Like mind-numbingly, terrifyingly, turn you to stone if you look at them ugly. Sometimes when Medusa, and it's usually just Medusa, not the other Gorgon sisters, but when Medusa shows up in movies, very often her eyes will glow and turn people to stone. But in the original myth, nah, she was just so ugly. So ugly. Like, she had fallen out of the ugly tree and hit every single branch on her way down ugly. So hideous that looking at her would turn you to stone. And there were lots of things about her that were ugly, and her sisters. The jagged, snarly, twisted fangs in her mouth. The thick, curved nails that came out of their fingers and toes. The brass scales that covered their skin. The eyes that bulged out of their head. The heavy metal wings that sprouted from their backs. And the nests of snakes that they had in place of hair. All of that was bad, each by itself. But then you take all of that and more and add it together, and you have the Gorgon sisters living on an island full of statues of men who had come to find them. And at this point, I'll mention, these weren't three monstrous sisters roaming the countryside turning people to stone. No. It's three sisters who had gone off to live on a faraway island and just wanted to be left alone. Yet somehow they still have a giant garden full of statues of men who came and got turned to stone. And I think there's a lesson there about leaving a person alone when they want to be left alone, bub. But I digress. So this Medusa, this Gorgon, this monster that it's not even venom or poison or fighting skill, just looking at this monster will kill you. That is the being whose head Perseus has now promised to bring back. And the ugliness, the turning to stone, isn't even the biggest problem with the process. But that is going to have to wait for next week. Because I'm going to wrap up right now. And next week we'll deal with, does Perseus get to Medusa, and what happens to his mom, and what happens in the in-between and the after. But for now, have a good night, find a good story.